Our first module of the course will be titled The Capitalist Revolution, and it's the reading, the prep for it is Unit 1 of the economy. And we hear a lot now if you're watching any coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests, which are very important, you hear, capitalism does this and it's terrible. But you hear that kind of thing a lot from critics, especially of the system. But rarely do we really understand what capitalism is, and people, I don't think, really understand whether they'd like changes of the current system that might still fall within the capitalist terminology, or do they really want something else? Anyway, so we think about what the range of capitalist systems that we see in the world today are, and there's a bit of discussion of what was before and what exists elsewhere now. We'll look at features of the historical world economy and the current world economy. In particular, we'll start with thinking about income inequality. Some countries have gotten a lot richer than other countries, even though all countries started at a pretty similar and pretty low level of living. We'll talk about measurement issues, really important for economists to get good data, and oftentimes it's pretty tricky to measure, so you'll get a flavor for that. Then we'll talk about just historically which countries started to get richer fast when, and then we'll turn to the question of why, and the hypothesis put forward by the authors is that it's the capitalist revolution that led to this rapid growth and sustained growth, which the world hadn't seen before. Right off the bat, our textbook authors point out one of the big problems of a capitalist system, or at least historical capitalist systems, and that is that property rights and rules were written in a way, originally anyway, that allowed members of a capitalist economy to use a lot of resources without having to pay for them. If you hired a worker, you'd have to pay for that worker. You'd have to pay that worker a wage. But you were often allowed to dump your pollution in the river and not have to pay anybody, put up smoke and ruin the clean air without having to pay anybody. So you're using up valuable resources that aren't priced because everybody owns them together, which historically has meant that nobody asserts property rights. And that's led to a lot of problems, most notably currently the issue of climate change and global warming. Everybody's been allowed to just dump tons and tons of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and it's perhaps threatening humans and other life forms' ability to live on the planet comfortably. Anyway, we'll talk about that severe limitation of a lot of capitalist systems, maybe all of them. That's an interesting question we'll discuss. Anyway, then we'll turn back to capitalism and say, okay, such as it is, why does it work to create such riches? And we'll in particular talk about the gains from specialization and trade. And then we'll close with an examination of the many very different types of capitalism we see in the world. And I would argue that people that argue for an overthrow of capitalism in general are really criticizing the particularly American form of capitalism, and that some modifications of the rules of the game that still feature to create a system that still features the institutions of capitalism is probably what most people are arguing for. Who am I to speak for these people? But that's my understanding. Along the way, this first module will learn how the course works, so there'll just be a lot of learning about the nuts and bolts of the course. And I expect that you're not supposed to know it already. We'll figure it out as we go. And so your patience, if I haven't told you how to do something, please ask me, geez, what do you mean by that? And we'll all learn together. Anyway, well, each module is structured very similarly. I'll ask students to do an opening activity before doing any reading, just some thoughts. I grade these on completeness, not on any insight, any super profound insight anyway. I want evidence that you're thinking about the question and putting something out there that seems to make sense to you. But that's what I'm grading on, not whether you're right or wrong. Then I'll have students prepare carefully beforehand, and that preparation should include handwritten notes and SQ3R method that I'm going to have a video about. SQ3R is scan, question, and then 3R is read, respond to the questions that you asked, and review as you study for quizzes. Don't reread as you study, but do glance at your notes to trigger the important elements of each section. And then we have this individual quiz. We'll start with day 2, our first individual quiz on the syllabus and unit 1 reading. Those are meant to be open note, closed book. Obviously, you're doing it online somewhere else, the individual portion, and even the team portion where we're all together in the class. I still am not going to be able to go visit you and see whether you're looking at the text or your notes. The quizzes will be timed, so you'll run out of time if you haven't done the reading. The notes hopefully are more compact and you can refer to your notes. But the real reason I want you to do notes is that the act of note taking starts creating paths. You're having to process the information you're reading into a different form and expressing that. You're creating neural pathways in your brain that will then reinforce with classwork, and that taking notes is processing information at a much deeper level than if you're just reading without taking notes. There's a ton of research on that. I'll post some research on taking notes by hand, a summary of some. I won't post the original studies, although they're interesting. It turns out taking notes by hand is better than typing things at a computer in terms of retention. And I think it's because you're just having to make more work. You're having to do more work, I should say, to translate that information into your handwritten notes and then using muscles to express that. You're burning these pathways in your brain. Your brain is this collection of cells, and there's all these 0-1 switches in there. You're turning on, turning off as you think. I have billions and maybe trillions of them. The stuff you remember is the stuff you work with. So taking notes makes you work at a much higher level than not. Anyway, then so you'll take an individual quiz and you'll take it as a team and you'll argue with each other. No, my answer is right because I've taken this note down. It's got to be this because, and no, I read that differently. My notes say this, and I don't think your answer makes sense because that. And that conversation where each student expresses their understanding and then gets feedback, that's really powerful. That's the key to learning and remembering anything, including economics. Then I'll provide some explanations on the harder questions, and I'll probably do most of that by screencast. Given the online nature of the course, even in a face-to-face class, I tend to give most of those explanations by screencast just because the class time ends and we're going to start with the second class of each module. We'll start doing application of exercises, and so 3 out of 4, 75% of the class periods in a 2-week session will be taken up with applications, and that's where we apply the economic knowledge that we've grappled with on our own and started working with us with our classmates. We'll apply that to increasingly complicated cases, and I'll have teams make a complex decision and develop evidence for that decision. I'll designate a team reporter after the team's work is done. For when we get together as a class, I'll have the reporters from each team argue amongst themselves. We'll all be watching to defend each team's choice, and I'm going to have teammates take notes. That conversation is where the material that's going to be on the test comes out. Then I'll close each activity, maybe during the class period in the synchronous online session, maybe by screencast. Screencast, I tend to talk over slides, so you don't have to look at my, again, non-movie star face, but that's part of figuring out what the professional economists think of it. That's going to be where I weigh in. And then this first module will also be getting used to the tools. I've got Jamboards. This Google Jamboard is a shared whiteboard app that's free with your Pacific account. And it's free to any account, it gives us a space to share our thoughts and to record our thoughts, so you can create a history of your thinking. You can either do that all at the same time via a Zoom session that you initiate and invite others to join, or you can do it asynchronously, where each student weighs in puts their thoughts on the Jamboard. You do that in 2 cycles where everybody can look at each other's thoughts and then have a round where you come to consensus. It's much easier to do it by Zoom, and I will have the first part of each 95-minute class, the first 45 minutes will be set aside for that work, and I'll be available to answer questions as you have them. However, if you want to do it asynchronously well before class, or do it in a Zoom session another time, that's totally up to you. We'll meet the last 45 minutes of the 95. So from 1:50, 10 to 2, to 2:35, to when we're doing application exercises. We'll meet as a group via Zoom at that time. And then I would recommend having somebody from each team take a Google Notes. So you create a Google Doc and take notes on that conversation and my closing remarks, so that you have a record. It helps when it comes time to study. I will put up study guides that will try to signal to you what kinds of questions will be on the exam. So that'll be good practice. We don't have an exam until after Module 2. All right, well, I'm really eager to dig into this with you, and that time is coming soon. Enjoy the reading, and it can be challenging if you're not used to reading nonfiction, but I really need you to develop that skill in life. We learn most of what we learn because we went and read about it either online or in the manual of a computer or whatever. You got to be able to develop that skill to read and teach yourself information. We'll of course work with it as a group, and we'll learn it much better for doing so. But most of what we learn in life, we learn by hunkering down with a text and then talking with other people at work or wherever to refine our understanding. So we'll do that over and over again.